Origin Rex, and this is why the destruction of this dam is breaking Ukraine by channel Real Life Lore. Whenever there is like current conflict type of videos from Real Life Lore, I usually try to react to it as soon as I can because they're really good. Of all the videos I watch, lots of them I guess I react to it, but some of them I don't. So Real Life Lore video always has something that the others don't, right? And they're really well done, big, usually half an hour plus. This is half an hour video. So yeah, this is gonna be fun. Fun is a weird word, not fun. This is going to be informative. It's not fun. It's just all this shit. They destroyed a dam. I mean, I don't know. This I'm pretty sure this is a recent news. Even though I don't keep with the news, like breaking news, I don't usually do that. And the way Google and everything's made, like if I don't check out the news, they're not going to recommend to it. Like it's not going to pop up anywhere, notification or anything. So yeah, I've never heard of it, but yeah, apparently there you go.
In the early morning hours of the 6th of June 2023, a series of powerful explosions rocked the Novokakhovka Dam here in southern Ukraine, one of the largest dams in the entire country, the aftermath of which was captured by this aerial drone footage that you're watching right now. Behind the dam was a reservoir of water containing around 18 million cubic meters worth of water, roughly equivalent to the volume contained within the entire Great Salt Lake in the US state of Utah. And that's the water you're watching right now flooding through the blown-up dam downstream towards tens of thousands of civilians and their homes. Shortly after this video was filmed, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, tweeted that Russia was responsible and that it likely constituted the greatest technological disaster in European history seen in decades. The Russians, conversely, blamed the Ukrainians for the dam's sudden destruction, which is extremely unlikely, for reasons that I'll get into very quickly. The dam's destruction sent a flood surge of water downstream the Dnipro River that directly placed tens of thousands of civilians at risk, and likely destroyed electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes that once relied on the power the hydroelectric dam generated. Kherson, a major city that had a pre-war population of nearly 300,000 people, sits directly downstream from this dam, and the flood waters its destruction unleashed. And moreover, the dam's destruction is likely to generate catastrophic consequences for Ukrainian agriculture and even Russia's own control over Crimea, while also generating new fears over a potential nuclear meltdown at Europe's largest nuclear power plant further upstream.
That's what Russia is at right now. They will even hurt themselves in Crimea, but screw it. We'll take that chance. Holy shit. I mean, flooding, look, years ago, I mean, more than a decade ago, I remember there was a flood here where I live. And, nowadays, I don't know, now this kind of, I don't have OCD, but kind of OCD like cleanliness, I wouldn't be, but at the time I was a kid and I could care less. And I remember having waters like 3 or 4 feet tall, something like that, right? I nearly drowned just walking out. I don't know, I was going to school, so I don't remember. Remember like how awful that was, right? All the flooding, just simple. And I remember how there was a lightouts for a long time. Like I don't know, I think it was 2 days straight. It was just like, yeah. I know some people are hitting the bed. They have frequent blackouts, like 2 days. Oh, we have a week here. But still, like it can be really overwhelming, right? So yeah, this flooding situation will fuck up a lot of things, and it can make places really dangerous, right? If you don't have great electrical grid and things like that, they could cause really strong problems just to live there.
From the dam. In effect, the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam and the biblical scale flood it has caused in Ukraine represents one of the most significant humanitarian and economic disasters seen in Europe this century, and it marks a major escalation and turning point during the war in Ukraine, and the consequences of it will reverberate across the
Escalation. I mean, how can you escalate more than this already is? It's a proper full-on invasion at this point. How many people have died? How can you escalate anything more from here? I guess the escalation is war crimes, right? I guess because it's directly hurting civilians. But I think that something like that has been happening too. I guess this is a major scale one. I don't know.
Battlefields in the future of the country for years or even decades to come. So let's take a closer look at what all of this really means and why this is all happening in Ukraine right now. The Dnipro River itself is probably the most geographically significant feature in the whole of Ukraine. It runs across the entire length of the country from north to south, and it splits the country roughly in half. In a sense, the Dnipro River is basically like Ukraine's version of the Mississippi River. But the river doesn't begin in Ukraine. Its headwaters rise further to the north within Russia, nearby to the city of Smolensk, where it is locally known as the Dnieper River, before then running through Belarus and then finally on into Ukraine, where it finally empties at its delta by the city of Kherson in the Black Sea. It is the fourth longest river on the European continent, and during the Soviet era, the river became well known for its major hydroelectric dam projects in big reservoirs. For most of its history, the river wasn't a fully navigable one all the way from the sea to the interior, because of a series of rapids blocking maritime traffic from passing through. The Soviets were determined to finally fix that problem as a part of their series of industrial waterworks on the river beginning in the late 1930s. And so the rapids were fully inundated by the modern Dnieper Reservoir by the early 1930s, transforming roughly 2,000 kilometers worth of the river from the Black Sea all the way up to the city of Dorogobuzh in Russia into usable, navigable waters. This transformed large Soviet cities at the time deep within the interior like Kyiv into somewhat oceanic-capable ports for ships and barges under a certain size, and tremendously benefited the Ukrainian and Soviet economies in the process. All in all, the Soviets constructed a total of 6 dams along the course of the Dnipro River. Dams that not only made the river largely navigable, but also generated large amounts of hydroelectricity for Ukraine's growing population and economy. The southernmost of these dams along the river that the Soviets built was the Novokakhovka Dam that was completed in 1956. Just 2 years after the Soviet Union formally internally transferred the Crimean Peninsula from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic over to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The dam's purpose and the reservoir behind its purpose were each designed to significantly benefit the local Ukrainian and the greater Soviet economy. Between the dam's completion and into the 1980s, a series of canals were dug from the reservoir behind the Novokakhovka Dam to bring water across the fields of southern Ukraine that changed its environment forever.
Also, those canals are going to be flooded. Holy shit!
Prior to the construction of these
that
canals,
will affect a lot of
much
people.
of southern Ukraine, including Crimea, was a warm and arid steppe with good fertile soils that would usually be great for farming, but with very little available water. Agriculture was historically nearly impossible nonetheless. The Soviet-built canals changed this by finally bringing water to these otherwise ideal agricultural areas. They quickly led to massive farms opening up all across the south of Ukraine, to the point where the Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces became some of the most agriculturally productive regions in the whole of Europe, with abundant wheat, soybean, and barley production. Among these canals that the Soviets built out of the Novokakhovka Reservoir was the North Crimean Canal, which began construction in 1957, a canal that diverts water from the reservoir behind the Novokakhovka Dam down to the Crimean Peninsula. This was highly important for Crimea's ability to properly develop, because nearly 90% of the peninsula's territory is an arid steppe environment that receives very little rainfall throughout the year. Most of Crimea's land only receives an average of 300 to 500 millimeters of rainfall in a given year, which, for the sake of comparison, is pretty similar to the annual rainfall experienced in Kabul, Afghanistan. Without man-made intervention, finding enough fresh water in Crimea for the irrigation required by industrial-scale agriculture was basically impossible, and so the peninsula couldn't support very many people all on its own. The North Crimean Canal changed all of this forever until the month this video was released. It diverted massive volumes of fresh water.
Yeah, all these talks makes me think like every country around the world who can should always, at least from now on, check their weak points, let's just say in this way, right? Like they have to have this kind of drill scenarios where they just think like, what if this country attacks this, what they will attack, something like this, right? What is our weak points, right? Like what is our geographical weak points, like which area doesn't receive enough water, right? Which area is really dry, which canal is really important, right? So they can, if do nothing, at least come up with this certain, defenses, just prepare for it, right? If something happens, they're already prepared for something like this. Because this what it tells me that like you have to do this, especially in the modern world, right? Where people's population is just going up and up, right? Demands are much higher about everything and needs are much higher as well, right? So even simplest living thing, somebody can choke on it and it will cause a major problem. This wasn't the case, even in world wars at this level at least.
From the Dnipro River down to the peninsula to the point where approximately 85% of all the fresh water consumed in Crimea was coming from it alone. Crimean agriculture and heavy industry were all suddenly possible, and then later on in the 1980s, the Soviets constructed the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant along the banks of the dam's reservoir further to the north as well. It would ultimately become Europe's largest nuclear power plant, capable of generating approximately 5,700 megawatts of electricity.
I'm scientifically literate enough to know, okay, it's not going to cause that much issue. But even, I guess, a bit of simpleton in me, like, why would you do that near the water? I don't know. I feel uncomfortable.
and used
Nuclear
the waters
plant.
of the reservoir to cool down their nuclear reactors and spent nuclear fuel rods. But that was all back during the Soviet era. Decades later, in 2014, the Russians invaded Ukraine for the first time and occupied and then annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Almost immediately after Russia's annexation, the Ukrainians decided to retaliate in really the only way that they were capable of doing at the time. The North Crimean Canal, as it always had, began in the reservoir almost immediately behind the Novokakhovka Dam. And since that area was still under their control, they decided to fill the North Crimean Canal's entrance up with concrete, and so blocked off 85% of the Crimean Peninsula's water supply. Doing so placed enormous pressures on the Russian government to adequately provide water on the peninsula for Crimea's 2.4 million residents and all of their agriculture and industry. The area of land under agricultural cultivation in Crimea crashed by nearly 90% without the North Crimean Canal's water supply.
90%.
And by 2020, many of the peninsula's residents were being forced into rationing their water supply. Ukraine was successfully besieging Crimea and placing pressure on the Russian authorities there.
Hey, imagine that, right? In Crimea, right? Most of the population is still Ukrainian, right? So they didn't like the invasion that happened to them in 2014 or whatever, right? But at the same time, imagine their mentality, like when they hear about this invasion that happened in 2020, right? 2020, no, not 2022, last year, right? So when this invasion happened last year, imagine them like, Russians are invading my people, the same way they did to us in Crimea. And somehow I'm happy about it because that means at least there's a chance the Crimean Canal will open up. Like, what the fuck?
Which is part of the reason why the Russians ultimately decided to launch their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In the opening days of the invasion last year, one of the very first things that the Russians did was to secure control over the entire length of the North Crimean Canal and destroy the dam that the Ukrainians had blocked it with, freeing up the water to flow back down the canal again towards Crimea for the first time since 2014, and relieving Crimea of its chronic water supply problem. But the Novokakhovka Dam right by the canal's entrance came up in the news a lot during Ukraine's southern Kherson counteroffensive between August and November of 2022 last year. You see, there's a bridge that runs across the top of the Novokakhovka Dam, and it represented one of only 3 highly strategic crossings of the Dnieper River anywhere nearby to the city of Kherson. With a pre-war population of nearly 300,000 people, Kherson represented the largest city in Ukraine that the Russians had managed to capture.
You keep saying pre-war population. What is now? What is the population now? Because I feel like the number would scare people, right? Like it's from 300,000 to holy shit, what, like 30,000, 40,000? That would be some fucked up number.
Since their invasion began. But it was also located on the western bank of the Dnieper River, exposed to the rest of Ukraine across a flat and open plain, and separated from the rest of Russian-occupied territory by the river and those 3 strategic crossings. From Ukraine's perspective, this would have been the best time for them to have been the ones to blow up the Novokakhovka Dam, because doing so would have flooded the Dnieper River downstream and denied the Russians the ability to adequately resupply their troops over on the other side occupying Kherson city. Thousands of Russian troops and their equipment would have found themselves stranded on the wrong side of the river, effectively encircled by Ukrainian troops with no meaningful way to acquire resupplies and nowhere left to retreat to. A Dunkirk-type situation for the Russians that would have ostensibly enabled the Ukrainian armed forces to advance and completely wipe them out as casualties or prisoners. But that's not what the Ukrainians ended up doing. Instead, American-supplied HIMARS in Ukrainian service managed to target and eliminate the 2 other bridges further downstream, leaving the Novokakhovka Dam open as the sole remaining bottleneck for resupplies and troop movements across the river. As the Ukrainian forces then advanced closer to Kherson city, the Russians made the decision in November of 2022 to tactically retreat thousands of their soldiers and supplies from the city back over to the eastern bank of the Dnipro, surrendering Kherson city to the Ukrainians without a fight in the process. That ended up getting us to basically the current state of the military front line between Ukraine and Russia, that for a large portion in the southwest currently follows the course of the Dnipro River, dividing Ukrainian-held territory to the west of the river and Russian-occupied territory to the east of the river. For months now, the Ukrainians have been actively planning their much-anticipated counteroffensive against the Russian front lines, having been freshly armed and equipped with advanced Western tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery systems. While the specifics of the counteroffensive are still fairly vague, the ultimate objective of it is fairly obvious. The Ukrainians are going to want to break through the Russian front lines somewhere and then advance far enough to the Sea of Azov in order to sever Russia's so-called land bridge, the area of Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine that currently stretches from Russia proper across the Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson towards Crimea. If this land bridge is severed, then Russia's ability to reinforce Crimea by land becomes impossible when combined with the destruction of the Crimean bridge across the Kerch Strait, which was already partially destroyed by a likely Ukrainian attack back in October of 2022.
That was
From
a big
Russia's
news there.
perspective, this development would effectively transform Crimea into an island, only capable of resupply by air and sea, and would thus place further pressures on Russia's ability to actually continue holding the peninsula, and their strategic naval headquarters for the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol. The most significant
That was one of the main reasons they did this, right? They needed this, right? Control, strong control in this one. So I don't think they're going to let go of the peninsula even if they have to use air or sea means. They'll at least hold this one.
problem that the Russians face during this upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive is that the current front line is massive. It stretches for more than 900 kilometers across Ukraine, and the Russians only have a limited amount of manpower available to adequately fill the whole front line up with bodies. The Russians cannot evenly distribute all of their troops across the entire 900-kilometer wide front. Because if
Obviously.
they did that, then the Ukrainians could simply concentrate the overwhelming resources of their counteroffensive at a single lightly defended area and overwhelm the local Russian defenses. But even worse for Russia, they have been running lower and lower on manpower ever since their invasion began. For the past several months, the Russian armed forces, and specifically their mercenary Wagner group, have all concentrated the overwhelming majority of their
Yeah,
own
what's with that shit, right? What's with the Wagner? First of all, the whole concept of Russia using a private division to fight for themselves feels weird, right? Like if you said that a few years ago when this didn't happen, like what you talking about? Russia can, second top two most military power in the world, right? They don't need a private division. Like all this, like the more I hear about it, like okay. And even then, like they went rogue or something. I don't even know there was some news. I need to find a good video about that if I can find it. Like what is happening there? Like holy shit, they're threatening Russia now.
offensive capabilities into besieging and capturing the city of Bakhmut within the Donetsk province. The ferocity of the fighting around Bakhmut has been the most relentless of the entire war so far, and has often been compared to the scale and devastation of the two world wars and the Battle of Verdun that was waged between the Germans and the French across 1916. By the end of May 2023, just last month before this video was published, the mercenary Wagner Group and Russia were each claiming that the city had finally been captured, after nearly 10 months worth of savage fighting. But in order to do so, they have almost certainly suffered a catastrophic rate of casualties. Western sources currently estimate that the Russian and Wagner forces suffered somewhere in the ballpark of 60,000 casualties during the battle for Bakhmut, 20,000 of whom were killed in action. To put that into perspective, that is around the same number of casualties that the Soviet Union collectively experienced during their entire 9-year invasion of Afghanistan all throughout the 1980s. All suffered during just a single battle in Ukraine for a single town.
Dude, okay. Every time somebody just said like, when they say like Russia and Ukraine, this is like the first major one since World War II. Everybody has these numbers about this war in Middle East, this, that, war in Afghanistan. It's not much of wars in the Middle East, let's be honest, right? It's a one-sided attack where other side, certain groups of guerrilla warfare, terrorists here and there kind of try to, react to it. It's not a proper war that, it hasn't been that, right? Doesn't matter which war you talk about, it's always going to be majorly one-sided, right? So this has been the first proper war since the World War II in that way, right? So, I know it's like feels surprising, like whole 9 years, this is more casualty than that. But yeah, this is a proper war. You have no, look, I genuinely believe when the war is over, whatever result is going to be, after 10 years or so, when they release an actual numbers, those numbers are going to be staggering. Like in 2035 or 2040, when people actually make video about that as history, those numbers will be some ridiculous number. They're like, oh, holy shit, this happened. And we are living through now. Because all the number, I don't believe those are true. The number is probably much bigger and worse. And not to mention the civilian numbers, like holy shit. Especially something like a Wagner group. Like this is like, complete their Hollywood level shit, right? There is always this movie, some mercenary group goes there and have no care about like war crimes and shit. Just basically kills everyone. And that's going to like, if somebody's going to be blamed, it's going to be Russian military, Russian government that's going to be blamed. Why do they care? So Wagner group, who knows what kind of conducts they're doing, right? How many people they killed that they didn't need to. I mean, in war, even for the psychological effect, they'll kill innocent people, right? So the number's going to be staggering. That's just ridiculous. Just when you hear those numbers, when it actually comes out, gonna surprise everybody because I'm sure that's gonna happen.
Now, meanwhile, Western sources also estimate that the Ukrainian side has suffered around 20,000 casualties of their own during the same battle. Up to May of 2023, the United States believes that since the invasion began in February of 2022, the Ukrainian armed forces have suffered around 150,000 casualties killed and wounded, while the Russian armed forces have so far suffered around 230,000 casualties killed and wounded.
I think it's much higher in Ukrainian side. They would want to deliberately hide the number because if the number says too high, it gives confidence to Russia, like we can do this. The lesser the number is, it breaks the spirit of Russia, like we are not achieving anything, something like that. But this is one of the elements. I'm pretty sure the number is much higher.
That is a higher number of casualties on the Russian side than the entire initial invasion force that the Russians sent into Ukraine to begin with, which was only around 100.
But people need to realize, right? Russia, Soviet Union, whatever, they have tendency of this, right? Whether it was in World War II or any war. Hell, go to any war, even the Napoleonic times. Their casualty number is ridiculously high compared to everybody else, and yet they still do well, right? It's like for them, it's like, yeah, casualty is much higher, so what? We're going to win. That's their mentality. So I don't think we should see their casualty number higher as thinking like they're going to lose or something, right? Every war, like holy shit, centuries past, they'll lose a lot of people and still fight back. I don't know. It's ridiculous every time I see that. Like one war makes sense, but every war, the number is way too higher of, whether missing or killed or whatever, and they still fight back and win or something.
190,000 soldiers. So, in order to compensate for these massive numbers of casualties, the largest Russia or Ukraine have experienced since World War II, the Russians have adopted a set of two different strategies. The first and most straightforward has been to simply recruit more bodies to shove into the front lines to plug up all the gaps. Last year, in September of 2022, Russia announced a partial military mobilization of reservists, intended to call up 300,000 more men to throw into the war. By February of 2023, many of these hundreds of thousands of freshly called up troops had already arrived on the battlefield, and by May of 2023, Russia likely had around 300,000 plus active military personnel within their occupied territories in Ukraine, despite having already suffered nearly 250,000 casualties.
Okay, what I don't wait a minute.
Nonetheless-
Okay, there you go. I can't have this pause at that scene. YouTube will go ballistic. All right. What I don't understand is that all these people, did they have mandatory military training long before, like every civilian gets that or something? Because if you have no military training at all, if you don't even know how to fight in a fucking bar, a brawl, basically, how you get, okay, first of all, wait a minute. Yeah, they were the former military persons, right? Partial mobilization was about like who was already in the military. That's what that was, right? I'm pretty sure it was. Because otherwise, if you're just simple civilian, how do you train in such a short time and go to the battlefield and actually fight? Before it was like simple weapons in world wars and things, right? But nowadays, every equipment is complicated. Don't you need really long training for that? But I'm pretty sure like this partial mobilization was about, who was already in the military, who had some who did basic service at least.
300,000 men defending a 900-kilometer-long front line is a difficult task to accomplish, and the Russians still have to strategically choose where they position all of them. This gets us into the second strategy that Russia can use to compensate for their losses in manpower: reduce the length of the front line itself, and reduce the total area their limited manpower needs to actually defend. The most obvious way for the Russians to have done this for a while was by blowing up the Novokakhovka Dam and flooding the entire length of the Dnipro River along the current front line between the dam and the river's delta by Kherson City. With the bridge crossings over Novokakhovka now destroyed, and the former two bridges destroyed long ago, there isn't a single crossing point anywhere between the river's delta and the city of Zaporizhia. And with the river's width significantly expanded downstream by the flooding, the Ukrainian armed forces will now find it extremely challenging to cross, as they will need boats or long pontoon bridges that will take a lot of time to set up, while they will be easy targets for entrenched Russian machine gun and artillery systems over on the river's eastern bank. Moreover, as the reservoir behind the dam depletes in size, it will leave behind muddy banks on either side, and as the
See, that's the thing about the modern world. They don't even need people to monitor something. They just have technologies, right? Motion sensors, drones and shit. So crossing that flooded area would be ridiculous. So that's never going to happen there. Right, before you have to put manpower even to monitor, but that's not the case today.
The river downstream of the dam finishes flooding, it will also leave behind muddy banks on either side of it. Basically, blowing up the Novokakhovka Dam creates an extremely difficult geographic obstacle for counter-attacking Ukrainian forces to cross over from Zaporizhia in the north to Kherson City in the south. And this difficult obstacle to cross will likely exist for at least a month or longer. In theory, this means that with the length of the river south of Zaporizhia secured against a large-scale Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians can now afford to safely redeploy many of their limited soldiers from this part of the front line to plug up less defensible areas where the Ukrainians are more likely to attack across, like in these areas on the flat, open plains across the occupied sections of the eastern Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk provinces, where the terrain will more favor Ukraine's recently acquired advanced Western tanks and mechanized infantry, as they seek to break through the Russian lines and carve across to the Sea of Azov. Since the Novokokhovka Dam has been under the control of the Russians ever since the invasion began, they've held this as an option now for months, and they've had plenty of time to rig it with explosives. And it appears that they've been preparing to do it for a long time. The Ukrainian authorities have been warning for months now that the Russians were preparing to blow up the dam. And in the months leading up to the dam's ultimate destruction on the 6th of June, the Russians were known to have been keeping the dam's sluice gates deliberately.
Yeah, the summer is coming basically there, right? So they have like a few months window before the winter. I guess after blowing this, they're gonna do a major invasion again. But what the problem is going to be this time is that it won't be half-assed like they did the first time, thinking we're just gonna win, like, you know, blitzkrieg type of mentality. No, they've failed there catastrophically. So now they're actually gonna do major calculation how to do it. And basically this time I don't know what result is going to be, right? Because if they mess up this time, it's just like their whole image is just down the drain. Like whole Russia's image is down the drain. Like they couldn't even do this, that kind of thing. So I feel like there's more on the line this time than ever. So this summer basically the level of the level of attack they'll do and success ratio is going to be much higher.
Deliberately closed. That effectively meant that they were holding the Dnieper River's water back in order to raise the reservoir's water level behind the dam. As a result, in addition to record springtime rainfall and snowmelt, the reservoir's water level behind the dam had reached an all-time record depth of 17.5 meters immediately before the dam was destroyed. This clearly shows that in the months leading up to the dam's destruction over 2023, the Russians were operating the Novokokhovka Dam in a way that would guarantee the maximum level of destruction once the dam was destroyed, unleashing the maximum amount of water possible downstream and generating the worst possible flood. And the timing of the dam's destruction now in June is almost certainly not a coincidence. Beginning on the 30th of May and stretching into the first week of June, the Ukrainians likely began conducting probing assaults into the Russian front lines in search of weak spots and in preparation for the full launch of their wide-scale counteroffensive. A swarm of Ukrainian drones raided Moscow in broad daylight on the 30th of May, representing the first time since 1941 that Moscow was subjected to an air attack. Then, a few days later, Ukrainian-backed militia groups raided across the border into Russia itself in the Belgorod province, where they took control over a bunch of Russian villages, and forced the Russians to redeploy some of their troops from the front line in Ukraine back to their northern border in Russia, while ordering the evacuation of the border town of Shcherbakino and its 40,000 pre-war citizens. Massive Ukrainian artillery and rocket strikes were beginning to pepper the Russian front lines, and so, sensing that the long-awaited counteroffensive was probably starting to get underway, the Russians probably took the decision to finally blow up the Novokokhovka Dam and deny this part of the front line as a point for the Ukrainians to advance across, enabling them to concentrate their troops along a narrower section of the front line and dig in. Blowing up dams and flooding areas of the battlefield to restrict your opponent's movements like this have long been a strategy used by militaries all throughout history. During the 19th century, the Dutch famously constructed a series of water-based defenses around the city of Amsterdam that could be deliberately flooded during wartime and effectively transform Amsterdam into an
Dutch have to do that. Like, holy shit. Like, Netherlands is the one place. Like, if you flooded, most of the country will be flooded. So they have to take that defense. Well, it's very easy to screw up the entire country.
Island and protect the city from a hostile land-based invasion. In 1938, during the Japanese invasion of China, the Chinese Nationalist Army deliberately destroyed a series of dikes on the Yellow River in order to cause a huge flood that would deny the Japanese the ability to advance any deeper into the Chinese mainland. That strategy worked, but it also came at the cost of up to 500,000 Chinese civilian lives. In 1941, nearby to the current flood in Ukraine, the retreating Soviets deliberately blew up a different dam on the Dnieper River in order to flood an area and deny the advancing Germans a pathway to continue advancing. And then in 2022, during the opening days of the current war in Ukraine, the Ukrainians themselves chose to blow up one of their own dams on the Irpin River in order to block off a potential invasion route that the Russians could have otherwise used during their advance on the Ukrainian capital. Kiev. Much of the area around the Irpin River is still flooded today from this more than a year later, implying that the areas of the Dnipro River further downstream from the Novokakhovka Dam will likely remain at least partially flooded.
See, flooding is so fucked up thing that if the area stays flooded for a long time, it causes permanent damage to a lot of things. So yeah, the flooding is really fucked up, right? More than people realize. People just like, oh yeah, flooded, water went in, right? It just deactivated certain areas or whatever. No, there's much worse situation. Like it damages soil and everything for a really long time, damages a lot of things, right? If the building stays flooded, their whole foundation becomes in question over time. Like this is so fucked up.
For a long time to come. The Novokakhovka Dam's destruction also carries with it numerous humanitarian and economic consequences that will reverberate across Ukraine and Europe for years or even decades to come. Tens of thousands of people downstream have since been forced to evacuate from their homes, while the city of Kherson itself has experienced significant flooding and damage to thousands of homes. The dam's hydroelectric power station is almost certainly damaged beyond all repair, meaning that it can no longer provide electricity for the around 350,000 households in Ukraine that it used to, only adding to Ukraine's deep electricity woes during Russia's targeted campaign of destroying Ukrainian energy infrastructure. But in the long term, the dam's destruction will more severely affect the Russian-occupied sections east of the Dnipro River, rather than the Ukrainian-held territories west of the river. First of all, the flooding itself has been...
Look at that, just like everything just went over. Look at that, just way too strong flooding. Look at that.
Worse on the Russian-occupied side of the river, because that side of the river is lower in elevation than the western side is, and so it's more exposed to the river's floodplain, with potentially adverse consequences for the first line of Russian military defenses that have been set up along the river's bank, and which are now potentially flooded. Second of all, the destruction of the dam over the long term will likely completely destroy the agricultural economy of southern Ukraine, a region that normally produces nearly a fourth of Ukraine's entire annual crop. Here are those same canals again from before that were all dug out back during the Soviet era, that all provide the overwhelming amount of irrigation required for the farms in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. In order for all of these canals to function, there has to actually be enough water depth back in the Kakhovka reservoir to actually feed them. So now, with the dam exploded, the reservoir is draining out and flooding downstream into the Black Sea, meaning that there's less volume in the reservoir to feed all of these canals, and they're eventually all going to start running out of water, meaning that all the farms the canals once supported are going to start running dry. There are already reports that with the water volume in the reservoir already massively depleted, the water in these canals have already begun flowing backwards and are draining back into the former reservoir. Since the dam and the river itself are still in the middle of an active war zone, the dam isn't likely to be rebuilt anytime soon, and the consequence is that Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea as well are all likely to devolve back into the arid and dry steppes that they were historically, and Ukraine's agricultural output for the next several years is probably going to crash. And this all might happen really, really fast too. This map shows what Crimea's vegetation situation looked like back in 2016, only a couple years after the Ukrainians shut off the North Crimean Canal that was providing the peninsula with nearly all of its water. And then, this map shows what Crimea's vegetation situation looked like just 2 years later after that, in 2018, as it was veritably dying of thirst without that water. After a couple more years from now, by 2025, the Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces will probably look pretty similar to this. And moreover, the North Crimean Canal will most likely no longer function as well until the dam and the reservoir are rebuilt, meaning that Crimea has now been permanently severed off from the source of water that was providing it with around 85% of its water. This massive level of destruction caused to the region's agricultural economy and water supply is rather curious, because if Russia truly was responsible for the dam's destruction, they have self-inflicted all of this upon lands that they legally claim to be their own. Last year, in 2022, Russia unilaterally declared that they were annexing Ukraine's Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk provinces all into Russia, in addition to Crimea, which they also declared to annex back in 2014. To unleash this amount of long-term economic destruction within these territories by destroying that dam in exchange for short-term battlefield advantages suggests that the Russians are not extremely optimistic about their long-term future and control of these territories, and it more appears to be a kind of scorched earth tactic.
But doesn't that raise a question like, did Russia did it really? Or is Ukraine is part of this as well? because more fucked up scenario, like this could be like hurting themselves, but to create more crisis scenario to put pressure on Russian. I don't know. I have to really deeply watch, the details about it, but I don't know. It just still feels weird, like why would they hurt their own people, right? I don't know. They might have some intel that suggests like Russia is gonna, just come up with really strong, forces in summer or something. So they might take drastic measures like that. Ukraine could have done this too, right? The way it shows like how, because in a way, if Russia's all these Russia-controlled regions, if they go into crisis, they are less likely to support Russia moreover, right? Ukraine can show, see, Russia can't even handle that shit or something like that. I don't know.
If and when Russia retreats from Kherson and Zaporizhia now, they will be leaving behind a region with a completely sabotaged agricultural and industrial economy that'll be very difficult and very expensive for the Ukrainians to rebuild. Similar to Saddam's tactic back in 1991 when the Iraqi army was retreating from occupied Kuwait and blowing up Kuwaiti oil rigs all along the way. And then there were the further potential consequences for the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant further to the north, the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. The plant relies on the water from the Novokakhovka reservoir to feed its pond, which it uses to cool down its nuclear reactors and spent nuclear fuel rods. Most of the reactors at the plant were turned offline by September of 2022. But the remaining problem is that the spent nuclear fuel rods at the site take several years' worth of time to actually cool down, and they continually need fresh supplies of cool water that entire time to keep cooling. If the plant runs out of water from the Novokakhovka reservoir drying up, that could be bad news indeed. But right now, the International Atomic Energy Agency, a UN watchdog organization with monitors present at the plant, are still saying that there is no immediate emergency to worry about, because the plant has enough reserve water to keep up the cooling for at least the next several months. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is thus not very likely to develop into another Chernobyl-type event for Ukraine, yet. And it will hopefully
for a few months though.
Regardless, Russia's likely intentional destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam is highly likely to be legally classified as a serious war crime. Under the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions that were adopted in 1977, Articles 53 and 56 specifically outlaw military attacks on dams, dikes, and nuclear power stations that will cause severe losses among the civilian population. Interestingly, the Soviet Union signed and ratified these updated protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and then Russia legally inherited that ratification status after it emerged from the Soviet Union in 1991. But then, in 2019, just 3 years before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin signed an executive order that revoked Russia's ratification of the 1977 additional protocols, meaning that from then on, Russia legally disagreed with the international consensus that military attacks on dams.
Are you serious right now? You can just back away like that? Oh, executive order. We don't believe in this shit, really? And come on, man. At this point, like war crime. That's like. There's been many war crimes, right, since the war began, right? Why is people surprised, this is a war crime, like, ooh, everybody just becomes, serious. Like, this is a war crime, this must mean big thing for Russia. No, it's not. For them, it's nothing. They will keep doing that. They're going to keep doing that in the future as well. It's a full-out war, man, right? Thinking that, one side's going to be stable, gentleman, like, when it's a war, right? It's either, one side wins or the another. It's a proper war, all-out war, right? So this time, you can only attack civilian, only attack soldiers, not civilian. You can only attack soldiers, not civilian. You have to go, get abide by these rules and regular. Yeah, they're not going to listen to all that shit. It's a full-out war, right? People are surprised they're war crimes. Of course they're going to be.
Dams constituted as war crimes. Ultimately, the long-term effects caused by the Novokakhovka Dam's destruction will play out over a very long time, and most of its humanitarian, economic, military, and legal consequences will reveal themselves over the coming months and years. It seems like ever since this decade began, there's been a nearly constant.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Look, to me, when 2019, when he just backpedaled, like, okay, we don't agree with this Geneva Convention shit. There should have been a major red flag. Like, why are you talking about that? Why are you talking about anything war crime-ish at this point? Why are you backpedaling from that? That should have been like much bigger red flag. Like, okay, Russia is preparing to do something apparently, and there you go. In a year or two after that. All right, this is just horrible news, right? But the scale of it just going to increase and increase. And like he said, like when all shit goes bad, right? that's when it gets even worse. So that nuclear plant thing, like that could go out of hand as well in a few months, right? I don't know. The war has become slow paced in that way, right? So when people stop hearing the news about Ukraine and Russia, was they're like, okay, everything's dialing down. No, it's not. It's just in a somewhat pause. It's just gonna get worse, right? And at start everything feels worse, but that's just the start. By the middle of it, when the war is over, a lot of regions will be so damaged, they will be impossible to recover them going forward. Things will be just, worse and worse for decades and decades, who knows. Right, well, that was why the destruction of this dam is breaking Ukraine by the channel Real Life Lore. Support the Real Life Lore by going on the original video page link and, clicking on brilliant.org, brilliant.org/Real Life Lore. And yeah, I'll see you next time.